Mondays with Mike. Mondays with Mike. Mondays with Mike.
Okay, vaccine battle lines drawn. We saw Robert Kennedy brought before Congress to testify, and lately we've seen arising in the West, Washington, Oregon, California, talk of an organization on the West Coast to take up the mandate of the CDC while it is in shambles. But how do we know that it is in shambles? What circumstances lead us to that conclusion? I guess that's my first question. Why does it appear that the CDC is in shambles?
It's never a good sign when a significant number of the employees of the CDC are calling for the resignation of the head of Health and Human Services, and when the director of the CDC is fired, when a bunch of senior members quit in protest to send a symbolic message that this is not cool. The situation isn't good when that happens, when you have any institution, but particularly government, because the people who quit, who resign, quite a few, they were long-term CDC employees. They'd worked on a whole lot of different things, and they were sending a pretty strong message all across the media that things are not going well at the CDC, that the situation has gone awry because there's not an agreement as to what constitutes truth, really. There's a disagreement about the validity, essentially, of scientific expertise. Probably the most significant thing that happened there was when the whole panel that recommends vaccines in the United States got fired, all of them, and were replaced with a much different kind of panel of, I guess you could call them experts, but there's some disagreement, some controversy about the strength of the expertise of those who are on the panel that were placed on the panel.
Perhaps we would call them enthusiasts as opposed to experts.
Yeah, that's probably one of the big disagreements, is that prior to this current panel, the people who are on the panel, most of them were considered experts in the field of vaccines, medicine. They had the background, the experience in terms of their work history and all that. And the current panel, not as much, right? It's a little different. But the other concern is the fact that it's never been done before, that this panel has never been summarily all fired all at once. And because this became a big issue in the hearing, actually, when the senators kept asking RFK Jr., how can we trust essentially what this panel is saying? And he's going, oh, it's an independent panel. The conclusions they arrive at are all independent of me. But the problem there is that the head of HHS recommended the whole panel, right? So it's not as if they're completely removed from a certain kind of bias, right? That they essentially got the of RFK Jr. the stamp of approval when they were recommended to be on the current panel. And so it's a little different. There's a question of whether the biases they have towards certain beliefs about science are influencing the recommendations that are going to be given. And this panel matters a great deal because almost all vaccines in the United States go through this panel.
Yeah, and it's no job for hobbyists. I'm wondering, because Susan Menarez, she was the CDC director, and she was fired 29 days onto the job, and she alleges that she was, there might have been a paywall or something, but so I couldn't read the article precisely, but I saw part of the article in the video. It was something like she was given a list, or she was told to approve certain people for a panel. This panel that she alleges she was told to approve certain people for, is that the same panel as we're talking about here?
I'm not sure if it's the same panel, but I do know that there's at least an allegation that she was also told to fire a whole bunch of the experts at the CDC. And she said, no, I'm not going to fire a bunch of these top scientists. There has to be cause and a reason.
There is cause. It is because Trump hates them. No, that's an Office reference. That's not the cause.
I guess the issue here is they went through so much effort to get her confirmed to the role. And then less than a month in, fired from the role, it just doesn't look good. It sends just the weirdest message of if they're struggling with the people they themselves choose to put into jobs for confirmation, to nominate, put through the whole process, go through all the hearings, because it was a Senate confirmed job. It wasn't just, oh, you're hired. It's the Senate action. That was the whole bit of contention where they were trying to say, oh, she resigned. She's like, nope, I didn't resign. You're going to have to fire me because I was confirmed by the Senate. That we're in this strange situation. I'm very puzzled. If they didn't do a thorough enough job vetting her beliefs and, I don't know, willingness to agree with what the Trump administration wanted before getting the job, what's going on with their vetting process? That's what I'm trying to understand here, because it's not as if you just stumble into a job like this. There's a whole process that has to happen. It's not just, congrats, you got the job. That's what I'm wondering about, is like, how bad is their vetting process? What's going on here? Are we going to go back to the time like during Trump 1 where we just have a whole bunch of acting heads of agencies? That's what was happening towards the end of the first Trump term, was all these heads of the agencies were either resigning or getting fired or going out the door for whatever reason. And then they were just getting replaced with acting heads who weren't getting Senate confirmation. And the question is that where we're headed again? Are we just going to have a bunch of acting people, just this like musical chairs of, oh, I don't agree 100% to the letter with what you did, so goodbye, here's the door.
I could imagine this being written in a book. We expected when there was a military coup that it was going to be swift and competent, and that the uniforms were going to be pressed, and the shoes were going to be shined. But instead, there was a great deal of bumbling, and it seems like there has been some deal of bumbling if they want to hire somebody who allegedly fits into their idea of these vaccines aren't necessary. Maybe such people are hard to find.
The situation is very strange because we're in uncharted waters, as it were, for what's going on with HHS and CDC. And the struggle I'm having is that they don't seem to agree necessarily on what the truth is. You see this in the hearing with RFK Jr., where he's, oh, there was corruption and failure, et cetera, et cetera. But they ask him, like, who do you believe? Who are you talking to? Like, where are you getting your conclusions from that you're arriving at these decisions that just seem so far out of the mainstream in terms of what the medical community agrees with in terms of the validity of science, the importance of vaccines? It's a strange circumstance we're in because so much power flows through the HHS in terms of the health outcomes in the United States. Those recommendations, and that was the point that was being made, I think, really well by Senator Warren, was that when you don't recommend something like a vaccine, then a lot of states and insurance won't cover the thing if it's not like a full-throated recommendation. So when RFK Jr. was asked, can people get the COVID vaccine? Can they get COVID boosters? He's going, oh yeah, they can get them. But then the point was that the CDC and the HHS aren't recommending the COVID vaccine, which means that it limits the availability. And that was the whole discussion, that there isn't some agreement that if you don't recommend something, that it reduces the availability. It's really weird that there's this sort of missing cause and effect link between not recommending and not receiving something, where they go, oh, it's available, you can get medicine, vaccines, etc. There's freedom of medical choice in the United States. But not really, and not in the way that our system's currently situated. Availability is limited by the recommendations of experts because it's a justification that insurance can use to deny access to things.
I wonder if it is meant that, oh yeah, everybody can get the COVID vaccine, you just have to say you have a pre-existing condition. Because it's recommended for now adults 65 and older, and for, what is it, infants? And then for others with these conditions. So, it's a real thing. Can you request it? And if you request it, is it going to cost you? And how much?
Yeah, that was the big issue. Was sure it's available, but its availability is limited by its cost. And the cost is influenced based off whether insurers will cover it. And whether insurers will cover something is influenced in part by whether the CDC and this vaccine panel recommends something. Yeah, it can become prohibitively expensive if you have to pay for it out of pocket compared to the alternative. And this is an issue for other things too, but I don't know. The long history, the unfortunate history of the hepatitis C, if you look at the debate they had about that before releasing it to the market of how expensive it needed to be, it tells you where the priorities are. The big gripe I have, and I think it's a gripe that a lot of the senators have too, is that when you cancel funding for research, so the mRNA vaccine research funding was cut for $500 million worth of research funding. The whole issue there is that the government can research stuff without a profit motive, that you can spend money researching things like orphan diseases and addressing issues of problems that pharmaceutical companies won't touch because there's no profit to be made from it. And if you don't fund that research through some non money driven source, non commercial driven source, then the issue becomes that some of that research is just never going to get done. We're never going to find the answers to cures for rare diseases and vaccines for things that might the like total pool of people who might actually be affected by the vaccine might be very limited, but it's worth pursuing because it could affect things like travel or affect things like our ability to operate in remote places or even in space, right? So imagine, for instance, space exploration. That's one I think about, that we do find a planet or a moon or some extraterrestrial object or place have some kind of disease that we don't understand. If you don't fund the research to understand that stuff, even if it's not profitable to understand, we may never be able to explore certain parts of space. And that limits our understanding of the universe. Or we'd have to rely on like robots and AI, right? Just no human exploration.
And then the robots are going where no robot has gone before, but humans not so much. We don't want that future. Okay, so people on the West Coast are responding to all of this with proposals of a new agency. How much do you know about that? Has that gotten off the ground? What are the ideas? What do you know about that?
Not much. It seems pretty new. They just announced it. It's not as if it's a robust thing. It's something that they're working on. They just said that they're going to do it, if that makes sense. It's like the precursor to it actually happening. Because it looks like there's other states that are going to join in. But the whole point of it is to, I don't even know. The issue here is that if you have these competing and countervailing narratives of some states saying, oh, we agree with this thing, and other states forming their own vaccine alliance and saying, oh, we have disagreements here, then the problem is you don't have a sort of national policy. That's the whole purpose of having something like the CDC or the HHS, is that you have a national consensus, an agreement, so that you can deal with issues like interstate commerce, right? Because the federal government's one of its purviews is interstate commerce. And so this alliance of, I don't know, 3 states, it's not going to make a dent in the national framework of vaccines and approval and creation. It's not a terrible idea in the sense that they can contribute their voice, but it's just a very small percentage of the actual amount of agreement that there needs to be for something like vaccines and things that are of a national import. Because remember, pandemics don't respect borders, right? The diseases don't care about lines on a map. We saw this during COVID. The ways to actually limit the spread of a huge pandemic is that you have to use the tools that are almost exclusively reserved to the federal government, mainly customs and border protection and denying people entry to the country, right? So quarantining and deciding who to let in through planes and boats and trains and all that. And that's not something that states have the power really to do. That's almost exclusively reserved to the federal government to control the levers, as it were, of power for controlling the spread of disease. So yeah, that, I don't know.
So, yeah, we take my daughter to the pediatrician, and she's got to get various shots. And during her lifetime, the guidelines, or at least the direction that it appears that the guidelines have been going, has been zigzagging on the map. There she is. And I just imagine going to the pediatrician and saying, no, I'll go by the CDC guidelines for this one. No, I'll go by the West Coast guidelines for this other one. And it just seems like too much window shopping. You preemptively answered my next question, which was, is this a good idea? And it seems like coping to me, because you have to win the election. But if it comes to it for a certain number of years, we may need to cope. So that's where I'm at with the whole thing. But it does seem a lot like window shopping.
Yeah, and remember too, for attending public school in the United States, I'm not so sure about private schools, but for sure for public schools, there's all sorts of vaccines you're required to get. And so it really matters what the government is recommending and saying, because parents have to make decisions of what vaccines they let their kids have if they want their kids to go to public school. And private school can be expensive, right, as an alternative. I don't know. The other issue too is I think a lot about the foster care system, that the United States has a lot of kids who are wards of the state who have no family, right? So effectively, in loco parentis, the state is their parent. If there's disagreement as to what vaccines kids should actually receive, then the question becomes, will foster kids be receiving like vastly different vaccines and medical treatment compared to the level of discretion that parents have in the vaccines their kids receive? That's where it gets really tricky, because it's not an insignificant number. There's tens of thousands of kids who are effectively, they're orphans, right? And if they don't get adopted, then the state is their parent. That means that all of society is their parent, essentially, right? Like that we're paying for their shelter, their medical, the education choices. The list goes on and on of where this really matters, where public policy really makes a huge impact, is on the people that the government's directly responsible for. So people in prison, people who are wards of the state, people in juvenile detention, even the immigrants, right, who are in detention while they're waiting for final orders of removal for deportation. If there's a disagreement over their medical treatment, then you get really weird situations where there could be a pandemic, and if the government doesn't agree on what's actually a valid course of treatment or vaccine, then you could have things like a spread of the pandemic that's unnecessary. There has to be usually some kind of agreement. And that's where we're at right now. There's not a unanimity of belief of what truth is, at least in the realm of medical expertise right now. And that's, I don't know, concerning, right? I think that's why all the senators were annoyed with RFK Jr. at the hearing. Is he doesn't seem to trust in the, I don't know that you call it the validity, but in that what the experts say. And that was troubling too. If you listen to any of the media interviews, one of the people who resigned was saying that RFK Jr. was never actually briefed by any of the top scientists at CDC that were within his department anyways. And it's okay. Then who is RFK Jr. actually talking to understand anything? Who's he talking to?
That could be a problem.
If you don't believe like the people that are employed to tell you things, who do you believe? What's going on here? That's the big question. Where is any of the information coming from? Does he believe anything from anyone? Because he was asked a question about COVID deaths, and he said essentially, I don't know how many people died from COVID. And it goes, wait a second. If you don't believe official government statistics on what constitutes a death from COVID, like what's a sufficient amount of information you need? Because remember, for any declaration of death, there has to be like a process. You've got coroners, you've got official people who say this was the cause of death. And if he's talking about how like the numbers were muddled a bit when people were dying, but they couldn't directly say it was COVID. So this happened, I think, in Florida was one of the places where there were people who like died, but they weren't listed in the official COVID statistics because they couldn't definitively say yes, this was because of COVID. I understand, but he didn't say that. He just said, I don't know how many people died. That's a little strange. That he doesn't even agree with like official statistics presented by the government. And he's the one who essentially is in charge of the statistics creating agencies for the federal government, right?
Yeah, and you would think that because he might say something like, in the early days, in 2020, we didn't know, like, somebody has COVID and they died, we don't know whether the COVID caused it. But you at the very least could establish some number of people who died with COVID, and then presumably you would have some statistical tools to at least make inference, if not medical tools, to say more directly who died from the COVID, because it ain't zero. So you would think it would come with some kind of answer, not just, I don't know. That doesn't seem really satisfactory for a congressional testimony.
Yeah, so that's the thing, right? It doesn't seem satisfactory aside from a congressional testimony. Of his job is to essentially help with the health of the whole country. It's really tough to make the argument that you know what you're doing if you have just so high a degree of skepticism as to what the truth even means for something as big as this, as big as a pandemic. Because then it becomes really questionable on the little things, on all the other stuff, the flu. No, that's not little, but all the other things along the purview, as it were, of this role, is what is the actual threshold at which you'll agree that information is information, that it's sufficient to act upon. If you just live in the clouds of, I don't know anything, I don't understand anything, I don't see anything, I hear nothing, what's reality? Are you just wading through life, like, floating in this sort of bubble of misinformation and uncertainty? Because this is a big job. This is an important job. Millions of people depend on this information that's presented from these agencies. He's like the second most powerful person in the whole government right now with respect to these agents. Obviously, the president's the most powerful, right? Because the president can fire virtually anyone within any federal agency. But RFK Jr. is essentially delegated a whole lot of power on his own. There's real questions about what does he actually think is truth, is reality, right? What is it? What's enough? What is the standard?
Yeah, is he pulling the Socratic thing where Socrates said, the only thing I know is that I know nothing? And then the joke, of course, goes, and then Socrates' roommate responds with, so you don't know who ate my Nutella. Mondays with Mike.